Jen Wilka, and I lead YouthTruth, an initiative of CEP that has helped amplify the voices of over 2.6 million students. YouthTruth harnesses student feedback to help school system leaders and philanthropic funders accelerate improvements. For funders to be effective, they have to hear from people beyond their own walls. This includes listening to multiple perspectives, including grantees, staff members, but also the people that they seek to serve. So in education, the students. In this spirit, we've worked with dozens of funders as well as hundreds of school systems, including the Barr Foundation, the Nord Family Foundation, Community Foundation Sonoma County, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and more. To listen to and learn from student feedback. These insights have in turn informed funders' understanding of community needs, illuminated differences in student experiences by demographic characteristics like race or gender, and helped identify and refine grant-making strategies and opportunities. So if you are joining us for the first time this morning, welcome. Just a few housekeeping details as we get started. CEP staff members are wearing yellow lanyards, so feel free to seek them out for anything that you may need assistance with. And we invite you to join the conversation online using hashtag CEP2023 on LinkedIn, Instagram, and X. Now it is my pleasure to introduce this morning's plenary speaker, Jacob Harold, co-founder of Candid and former CEO of GuideStar. Jacob is someone who's been a friend of CEP for many years, dating back to his time as a program officer at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. And we're so grateful to have him in our orbit. As you probably know, he knows philanthropy inside and out from his time leading GuideStar and at Candid. He also draws inspiration from some of his more eclectic life experiences, like growing up on a farm, or translating the poetry of the 6th Dalai Lama. And he's really interested in leadership and problem solving. And he's written an essential book for leaders called the Toolbox, Strategies for Crafting Social Change. So often as leaders, when we're faced with a problem, we turn to the hammer we know best, and we're in danger of everything looking like a nail. As Jacob recently reminded us on the CEP blog, if all you have is a hammer, you can't build a house. And in philanthropy, we're trying to do big things in a complex world. In a time of such complexity, with so many external threats from democracy to AI to climate change, no one single framework or approach is going to cut it. This has always been true, but perhaps is especially true now. So as a leader, when you're faced with a problem, in what context do what approaches make sense? How do you navigate? Jacob's new book and this toolbox of different frameworks for different moments with different needs is an incredible resource for leaders in philanthropy as we navigate this complex world. So put your thinking caps on, bring your questions, and please join me in welcoming Jacob.
So, how about last night? The conversation with Ada Limon. Is everyone still feeling from that? Feeling in the white space around the poems? I will say I'm going to be reading some poems as part of my presentation today. But last night I was sitting in my chair right here, and it occurred to me, wait a second, in a sense I'm following the US Poet Laureate. And I could kind of imagine Phil and Grace like conspiring in a corner, like, you know what would be a fun joke to play on Jacob? We know he's going to read some poetry, so we're going to have him follow the US Poet Laureate. So what I want to ask is, if you were here last night, please remember what the Buddha said, that comparison is madness. Show me some grace, because I will not be able to match hers, but I will do my best. So, I'm really glad to be here. It feels like a bit of a reunion, so many old friends and new ones. I'm going to start with a story about this woman right here. This is my mom, and I will talk about what she's doing in this image in just a moment. But first, I want to talk about something she would do when I was a small boy, 2 or 3 years old, as I would be running along a path or a sidewalk or down a hill, and I would trip and I would fall, like 2 and 3-year-olds do. And my mom would scoop me up and give me a hug and a kiss and make sure that if I was bleeding, it wasn't too much. And then she'd redirect my attention to the spot where I had fallen and kneel down with me and say, let's check to see if the ground is okay. Now, in a sense, this was a young mother's trick to distract a crying child from what was passing pain. But it was actually far deeper than that. This was a strategy that my mom had to try and expand my sphere of caring, my sphere of compassion, to actually think that maybe the ground deserved our attention, and that my own pain in that moment wasn't the only thing in the world. And she and my father did this for years with me and my sister, and I now do it with my own 2 boys. I think the 8-year-old thinks he's gotten too old for it, but and essentially that's what we're doing in philanthropy, right? We are expanding our sphere of compassion. And what I want to talk about today is how. How do we do that in a way that's as effective as possible in what is, as Jen said, a very complex and changing world. My mom worked in our sector. For most of my childhood, she ran outreach at the local AIDS hospice. At other times, she was running outreach at our church or working with people coming out of the criminal justice system. And I can't claim that her work was driven by rigorous strategy. What I can claim is that it was driven by love. That's why I love this image of her just throwing flowers in the air. And our challenge in this strange moment that we're in is to figure out how are we going to direct our resources, emotional, financial, physical, to make this world better. Because the world needs it right now, right? We are in what some people have called a polycrisis, right? Where we have intersecting, overlapping crises coming all at the same time. Climate change, pandemics, war, structural racism, political polarization. And it can feel overwhelming. And I think it's worth all of us actually just taking a moment right now and just asking ourselves, do you feel it? Do you feel the weight of this moment? I'm going to just say, I do. And I think it's important for us to allow ourselves to feel that. And the polycrisis is matched by something else, which has been called the meta-crisis, which is just how do we relate to all these things that are happening in the world around us? What is our relationship with the uncertainty and the complexity? And how do we understand it? Because the way that we understand it is going to determine how we act to try and address it. In the military, they talk about a VUCA world, V-U-C-A, a world that is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. I think we could add another letter, which is just fast. Things are changing fast. And I want to argue that the ways that we've thought about strategy in the social sector we may need to tweak them in order to operate in this complex world. The amazing thing, though, is that there are extraordinary individuals that are standing up in their own way for that better world. And there are extraordinary groups that are doing the same thing. And so we have, on a deep human level, people showing the best of their humanity, and society, at times, showing its potential as well. But as we look at this polycrisis in this VUCA world, I just think it's pretty clear that there are not easy answers. And I think if we allow ourselves to think that there are easy answers, we will ultimately run into the brick wall of reality. But what we do have are tools. And so today I want to talk about 9 tools and give you a chance to talk at your tables a bit as well. And more generally, just to think about all the resources that we have at hand to make a better world. So we're looking at close to $500 billion a year just donated given away in the United States of America. Around $40 trillion that is invested with an eye towards impact. Around the world, we're looking at about 10 million social enterprises and about 10 million nonprofits. And here in the US alone, 13 million people are employed by nonprofit organizations. Just pause and think about what this represents about the maturity of human society, that we have figured out how to make these sort of investments in a better world. Now, plenty of these organizations are not effective. Some of them are going against things that I believe in. Some of these dollars are wasted. But if you think about the sheer scale that humanity has chosen to devote to making things better, that is a source of hope for me. And it, to me, is something that is fundamentally a kind of abundance that we can draw from as we try to tackle some of these problems. And I think we are more likely to succeed when we begin with that abundance mindset, even fully sober about the scale of the challenges that we face. So the question then is, how do we get to this better world given all these resources that we have? And that arrow is strategy. And I define that as a logic for how you allocate your resources to achieve a goal. And in this VUCA world, I think we need to be prepared to have multiple logics. Many of you have probably been in this building. This is the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation on Sand Hill Road out in Menlo Park, California. And I was privileged to spend 6.5 years working out of this building. And I had an experience that most everyone in this room has had, which is the utter privilege of some of the smartest people in the world coming to you to share their ideas about how to make that world better. And I came away from this experience with two contradictory thoughts. The first one was an overwhelming sense of gratitude that I had been able to be exposed to so many extraordinary ideas and approaches and experiences, and a sense of obligation to share that. And that's a lot of what you'll find in the book, is me just trying to share what other people told me during that time. The contradictory reaction, though, was some frustration that so many of these brilliant people seemed convinced that their approach was the only one. I hear some laughter because I think people know what I'm talking about. And this sort of strange phenomenon that we have of picking a framework and getting so absorbed in it that we lose our ability to learn. Ada Limon last night talked about how it becomes a cycle where there's no curiosity. And so I think that's something that there are some people in our field, and I've been guilty of this in the past, have to figure out how to break out of. Reminds me of a haiku from Kobayashi Issa in the 19th century. The man pulling radishes pointed the way with a radish. You use the tools that are at hand. But ultimately, that is not going to be sufficient. Now let me quote from Abraham Lincoln in his statement to Congress in 1862. There were some important things happening in 1862. The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. I believe that is true again right now. The philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah said, "We need a multitude of pictures about the world, a gentle Jeremiad against theoretical monism." I love that, a gentle Jeremiad. I feel like that's what we're doing. And so I'm going to talk today about these 9 tools. I will go through each one. And in each case, I will explain the tool, offer one of many insights, give an example. In some cases, I'll throw in a poem. I want to highlight a couple things. One is I'm not saying that these are the only tools. There are others, and I would encourage you to think about what are the frameworks that you bring to this work. There are other ways of thinking about strategy. There's an entire discipline of military strategy. There's classical rhetoric. There's strategies of religious evangelism. There's art. But these are the 9 that I'm going to focus on, but I would invite you to think about others that feel appropriate to you. And I will also say that no one needs to be an expert at every single one of them. But I do think that we all have an obligation to try and familiarize ourselves with a range of ways of thinking. Next thing I'll say is, as I go through these 9 tools, I want to ask you to ask yourself 2 questions. The first question is, which one of these comes easiest to me? Which one do I naturally default to? And then second, is there one that is hard for me, that feels uncomfortable for me? And just note that. And later we'll do a little exercise around that. I will tell you right now that for me, it was storytelling comes hardest, and complex systems is where I naturally am drawn to. So I hope you all will go through that exercise with me. And I will also say that there are lots of ways that we can structure and organize these. We can think about them as operating at different levels. Some are more appropriate when trying to, for example, influence individual behavior. Others are better for collecting or gathering communities or organizations. And others help us think in systems. Some of them are really about bringing people or power or resources together. Others are really more about understanding. And then some are navigating this complex world. So, storytelling. This is a human impulse that it goes so deep in us. And it's an impulse to understand the world through narrative. And it's a place where I think at times, philanthropy and the nonprofit sector is very, very good at telling individual stories. But often I think we fall down when telling a bigger story about a system and how a change might happen. I said I was going to give an example, and by the way, each example is around the issue of climate change. I just picked one issue. And my example here is just that it's really remarkable and I think quite important that there's now a new genre of literature called climate fiction that is helping people wrap their minds around the problem of climate change and some of the potential solutions. There are so many different insights that storytelling can offer us. And I do not expect you to be able to read this, by the way. That's just to show you, to remind you there's lots of other stuff. But I'll just mention one, which is assigning characters. You can think about in classic storytelling, you tend to have a protagonist. They tend to have companions. Often there's a mentor. Often, although not always, there's an antagonist. And I find it to be an incredibly useful exercise to assign characters when thinking about social change strategy. Just for example, imagine a situation that we're all familiar with, which is a nonprofit talking to a foundation trying to raise money. And let's ask the somewhat profound question of who is the protagonist in that story? Is it the nonprofit leader who is there trying to pull resources together? Is it that the nonprofit leader is trying to trick the foundation staffer into thinking they're the hero? Is it the staff person whose salary is going to be paid? Is it the person who we're trying to serve? Is it the end beneficiary? And who ultimately has the kind of voice that's associated with being the protagonist? I also think it's important sometimes to be clear about an antagonist, and that sometimes in our work there is an enemy, and it's important for us to be honest about that. But very often the enemy is actually a situation or a system. You could go through this exercise in other ways as well when thinking about companions or mentors. But the important point is to actually think about your work as a story and go through the exercise of trying to assign characters. The next one is mathematical modeling. Now, this is another one of my favorites, I will admit. I have 10 equations tattooed on my right arm. It would not be appropriate for me to show them right now, but I find math to be an incredibly powerful tool, but it's worth noting that what is an equation but a story, where the variables in that equation are the characters. And that, again, we can begin to use these sort of frameworks to help understand the situation we're acting within and how we should proceed. We're going to share two of my favorite equations for social change. Both of these are radical oversimplifications, and that's part of the point, is they're an attempt to give us a little bit of a sense of how we might understand something complex. One is, again, an oversimplification, but impact equals quality times quantity. It equals the depth of impact times the breadth of impact, whether that breadth is across people or communities or acres, whatever it may be. A second equation is EV, expected value, equals big P, which is potential impact, times little p, which is probability of impact. Now, this one is really important because this allows us to be thoughtful about risk-taking and to see that sometimes that big P is worth it, even though the little p is small. Even though there's a small chance of success, the possibility of meaningful, lasting impact is worth it. As an example, I'll mention the ClimateWorks Foundation and a framework they used when they were launching that they called the Sudoku, where they basically were looking at global carbon emissions, and the columns here are different sectors of the economy, and the rows are different geographies in the world. And they started to look at, in a systematic way, carbon emissions in each of the cells and develop strategies that were specific to that particular cell. Pretty basic arithmetic, but profoundly important when thinking about how one might actually allocate billions of dollars to solve a complex problem. Another thing that's worth noting is they don't use this that much anymore. They used it for a while, it helped them organize their thoughts, and then they moved on to other approaches. But it provided a kind of grounding that I believe was very important in their early days. Third tool is behavioral economics. And you all have seen these lists of biases, right? Or heuristics, the way the human brain tends to work, that we are not as rational as we sometimes wish we were. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through all of these, but just to say, it is important for us to be thoughtful about the way our minds actually work. And there is an entire literature that we can draw from, a literature that is imperfect, but still useful. In the discussion yesterday about Mackenzie Scott's grants, I was really struck that a lot of it comes down to default settings. What is the default that we go into when we're making a grant? Is the default it's going to be a project grant that's 1 year, or a general operating support grant that's 7 years? And in the behavioral economics literature, there's been a lot of research into default settings. The most famous example is whether when signing up for a 401k, the default is that you sign in, or the default is that you are signed out. And that just switching that in no way takes away people's agency, but has a profound impact on outcomes. And that we in grant making, I think, have a similar opportunity to think about what are our default settings when it comes to how we allocate resources. A great example of the application of behavioral economics to the climate crisis is the company Opower that started to create these reports that would go out to individual electricity consumers, essentially comparing their electricity consumption with the consumption of their neighbors. And that simple bit of information had a radical impact on people's behavior and saved millions and millions of tons of carbon emissions because people are naturally competitive. Next one is design thinking. And fundamentally, design thinking is about listening. Let's see here. And, it's easy to think, listening, that's just, fortune cookie wisdom. And it is. I have that fortune cookie taped on my fridge. But there's an entire science now of thinking about how do you systematically listen to the people who are the end user or beneficiary. YouthTruth is doing this. And fold that into an iterative process that allows us to be far more systematic. I'll quote from Scripture. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 21, test everything and hold fast to what is good. So this combination of listening and iteration allows for a kind of progress that I think is extraordinary. The poet Cynthia White, think of the path as calligraphy, narrow where it borders the farmhouse and the horse pens. Think how beyond the open gate the stroke fattens, traveling upward into the dark. A great example is an organization that I'm working with now called Rewiring America that's trying to decarbonize the American economy through electrification, and has invested an immense amount of time and energy in thinking about how do we actually make it easier for an individual consumer to navigate all of the benefits and subsidies that are out there to electrify their homes. Highly recommend using this tool. I also will pause to just say, this is an example, or Rewiring America is an example of a new kind of ambition that I think is necessary and that we can open ourselves up to. Rewiring America just 2 or 3 weeks ago applied for $9.5 billion, with a B, $billion from the US government, from the Inflation Reduction Act Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, in coalition with Habitat for Humanity, United Way, LISC, and enterprise community partners, in order to try to decarbonize the US housing stock. Just think about that ambition. You know, how often in philanthropy in the nonprofit sector do we actually hear that billion word used to describe anything but a foundation endowment? And that also gives me some hope. Another thing that gives me hope is I'm taking my jacket off because it's warm in here. I felt very validated that I've seen people like fanning themselves, so. You know, I started my career in community organizing. And you know, community organizing is fundamentally about power. And it's an inversion of power in 2 different ways. So one is the classic image we've all seen of collecting lots of little fish together to be bigger than the big fish. And that is an essential part of it. But it is also, in order to be effective in community organizing, the organizer has to give power away. So you are simultaneously gathering power together and giving it away. As Toni Morrison says, if you have some power, then your job is to empower somebody else. And so there's this sort of incredible, fertile paradox in community organizing of giving away power in order to gather it together. I'll mention US Climate Action Network, where I'm on the board, as a really interesting example of how engagement with power can evolve over time. So USCAN was founded about 33 years ago by some of the first advocates who were addressing the climate crisis, who were mostly scientists and economists, and they were mostly white men. And they needed a place to get together and talk strategy, and USCAN succeeded at that. What has been extraordinary is to watch its evolution as the climate movement itself has evolved. And it has become an organization that is led by and controlled by people of color on the front lines of the climate crisis. It's a really, really interesting 3-decade evolution. And I believe that, in general, you can judge a civilization by how it defines the word we. And maybe you can do that for a sector. So I think a question for all of us is, how does philanthropy define the word we? Okay, next is game theory. Now, you know, game theory is a formalization of some of the puzzles of human interaction. And, you know, it uses these weird names like the game of chicken or prisoner's dilemma. But there is actually a rigorous analysis beneath it that provides some really important insights. And I will oversimplify what decades of game theoretical analysis has found. And that is that there's a winning strategy to cooperation. And that is, you start out generous. You hold people accountable when they screw you over, and you are quick to forgive. Now that may also sound like fortune cookie wisdom. I don't have another fortune cookie to share, but this has actually been shown mathematically over and over again in really interesting ways. But there are other ways to put this. Jeff Daniels is not just an actor, he's also a singer. He has a great line, "By being kind to strangers, you run the risk of them being kind to you." Adrienne Marie Brown also notes, interdependence is iterative. This all only happens when we are engaging with people over and over again. An interesting example from the climate space is RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, where by having a cluster of states come together for some of their carbon regulatory systems, they make it much harder for people to cheat and a lot easier for them to collaborate. Markets. So there's a lot to be said about markets, and an interesting thing about philanthropy is that we simultaneously find ourselves as basically cleaning up the messes left behind by the market, while also ourselves being a product of the market, and building business models that operate within the philanthropic market. So we can dismiss market-based thinking, but I think we do so at our peril. But what we can do is be very, very honest about the way that the market can distort behavior in ways that are not going to optimize the things that we really care about. A great example from the climate space is block power. I'm going to drink some water from this. It makes me feel like I'm in like an elementary school cafeteria. It still tastes good. Which is helping individual homeowners bundle and finance upgrades to their house to make their home more energy efficient. Perhaps my favorite is complexity science. And this is quite simply the science that tells us how is it that the whole can be greater than the sum of its parts. And this is fundamentally a science of systems. And the truth is that most systems change, most social change is systems change. And again, there's an entire science that's been created that can help us have a language for thinking about how we deal with complex systems. And we can look to so many examples in nature. I will come back to this later in the talk, the Starling murmuration, where a whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Just one example of the language that systems theory provides us is stock versus flow. So, stock is the amount of water that's in a bathtub. Flow is the water going in or going down the drain. And over again in social change, I think we get these two things confused. You see it often when looking at nonprofit finances and the confusion between an income statement and a balance statement. But I think it shows up also in climate change, for example, and thinking about the stock of carbon that's in the atmosphere, carbon that's being put in the atmosphere, and that which is being drawn out. This could play out when thinking about analyzing the community of people who are unhoused in a given city, for example. There is a stock there, and then there's a flow in and a flow out. So the language of systems theory allows us to be more precise, and I think that brings great power, and it ultimately allows for creativity. There's great work on climate change from a complex systems perspective coming out of the Santa Fe Institute. All right, here's the last tool. And this, I want to start with this image. So this is a hotel. This is the Nishiyama Onsen Kyunkan, which is a hotel in Japan near Mount Fuji. It was founded in 705 AD. And it's been managed by the same family for 52 generations. Now, every piece of wood and stone and glass has been replaced over those 52 generations. But the institution endures. And so that just raises to me, like, what is an institution? I mean, to me, it's a pattern of people that are doing something over time. I'm going to talk later about how I do believe that permanence should not be our default when it comes to institutions. But there are times where it makes sense, often when there's a connection to place. And what lessons could we in philanthropy learn from the managers of that hotel? This gets also to purpose. And colleague and mentor Faye Twersky always says, start with purpose. It's always where we need to begin. And as I look at the institutional infrastructure of philanthropy, I think the best organizations are the ones that are deeply and tightly tied to their sense of purpose. But I think we all have seen cases where purpose ends up being diverted from or separated from the core functions that are driving the institution's decision-making. Interesting example in the climate space is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has somehow figured out how to aggregate the opinions of thousands of scientists from all over the world and do so in a systematic and transparent way. So I'm trying to decide how many poems to read right now. I think I'm going to read two. There's one I forgot. I'm going to go back to a poem that I sometimes read when talking about math. And I do this because there's a fundamental tension between the qualitative and the quantitative, the mathematical and the verbal. But I want to argue that we in philanthropy have an obligation to count. And so forgive the darkness of this poem. But this is by Wisława Szymborska, a Polish poet who won the Nobel Prize in Literature, I think in 2002, writing about the Nazi death camps. Write it down, write it with ordinary ink, on ordinary paper. They weren't given food. They all died of hunger, all. How many? It's a large meadow. How much grass per head? Write it down, I don't know. History rounds off skeletons to 0. 1,001 is still only 1,000. That one seems never to have existed. Now, there are different ways that we can interpret that poem, just as Ada Limon spoke of last night. We can all feel it in the white space around the poem. But to me, that is about the fundamental dignity that comes with being counted. And that I think too often in philanthropy, we allow math to be something that is dehumanizing instead of being humanizing. And that one who never seems to have existed has lost their dignity because they weren't counted. And this has implications, I think, more broadly as we think about our work. Amanda Gorman says, to be accountable, we must render an account. Now think about that. We care about accountability in our field. We have to render an account that we can be held accountable to. So I share all of that to just remind us of, I think, that there is moral depth to this work that we can hold on to. Or another poem from Rabindranath Tagore, the great Bengali poet. What great weapon for the fighting of evil have you placed in the quiver, bound to the waist of the young warrior? Will you, perhaps, where a tide of blood besmirches your path, where there is malice and discord, construct a dam of peace, a place of meeting and pilgrimage? Who can say if there is written on your forehead the invisible mark of the triumph of some great striving? Now, in that poem, we have metaphors from war, but applied to the building of peace. So now, I've gone through those 9 tools. I've offered some of the tensions and dynamics that are at play. I now want to do a quick exercise. This is going to be very quick. And I'm going to ask you all to stand twice, if you're able. Once, when I say the name of the tool that comes easiest to you. and once when I say the name of the tool that comes hardest to you. So if we could raise the lights just a little bit. So first, can you stand if it is storytelling that comes easiest to you? All right. Now stand if it is mathematical modeling that comes easiest to you. And now design thinking, iteration and listening. Okay, next, community organizing. Oh, I skipped behavioral economics, didn't I? Behavioral economics, understanding people. All right, game theory, figuring out how to cooperate. Institutions, yeah. Not that many people. All right, institutions. Awesome. We have the head of the Effective Institutions Project over there standing, that's good. Literally. Complex systems, managing complexity. Here's my people, all right. And then markets. Any business nerds here? All right, great. Awesome, well, there's my former boss. So isn't it just kind of amazing I mean, we just witnessed the collective skill sets in this room, right? We just witnessed the diversity of ways that people feel really comfortable. People feel really grounded and capable in a particular approach to doing good in the world. All right, now let's look at the flip side, which is let's look at the one that is hardest for you or comes least naturally. Start with storytelling. Okay, I'm going to do it in the right order this time. All right, behavioral economics. All right, everyone totally understands people. All right, design thinking. This one actually comes pretty hard to me because part of the idea with design thinking is you don't know the answer, and I kind of want to know the answer. All right, what about community organizing? It's come hardest for anyone? It's another really difficult thing to do well. All right, mathematical modeling. Okay, all right, game theory, figuring out how to get people to collaborate, okay? All right, managing institutions. All right, complex systems. It's just too complex, I can't handle it. Yep, I feel that. All right, and markets. You know, my dad was also in the nonprofit sector. And he once actually said to me, you know, Jacob, I think I'm allergic to money. And he meant it actually literally, because he had just come back from a fundraiser, and he had all this cash, and it was from lots of people, and it was kind of dirty, and it had germs on it, and he got sick. But I think there was also a deeper truth there of, you know, how we relate to money in this field. Okay, so I'm gonna, we've got about 25 minutes left. I'm gonna open it up for questions 2 different times. So I'm gonna do it now and just take like 2 questions, and then we'll move on and do another exercise. So I would love to take a couple questions, or comments are fine, that anyone may have at this point.
Hi, good morning. My name is Wendy Castillo, and I'm with the Bridgespan Group. My question is about changing the minds of donors, because, I mean, I, and probably most people in this room agree with all of this, but how do we change the mind of the people with the billions and trillions of dollars so they can open their pockets?
Good question. How do we change the minds of donors? I mean, donors are people too, right? And so, you know, this same rhetorical strategies that we might use with a colleague, we can certainly use with donors. I think part of it is how we communicate. And I'll just say, you know, I made every effort in this book to communicate with different learning styles. Some people learn through stories, so there's stories. Some people learn through equations, so there's equations. Some people learn through data. And that if we want to shift how anyone behaves, when we don't know how they think, then we have to approach them in multiple different ways. And so I think we have an opportunity with donors to do exactly that. I also was thinking about the example that was given, from the Haas Junior Fund yesterday of, the board members and how it was a process that involved patience. And there was great wisdom in that example. And, in the end, as the saying goes, the people said they did it themselves. And so I do think we have to be patient as we work to convince donors and anyone to have a more multiplicative, multidimensional understanding of how change happens. All right, maybe one more question.
I was really taken in your storytelling example when you were talking about, the nonprofit leader coming and who is the hero of this story, and that you didn't name as a possibility the program officer. And it just strikes me that there is no shortage of people in our sector, or an attitude in our sector sometimes, that our institution, ourselves, are the hero of the story.
I think that's right. I mean, and to a certain extent, there is an element of truth to that. We're all heroes of our own story, and a lot of us, not all of us, but a lot of us made sacrifices to do this work. But there is a fundamental danger of arrogance and ignorance that can come if, in a relationship like program officer and grant applicant, the program officer is convinced that they're the one who's the hero. So amen to that. I will add something that Phil mentioned yesterday, which is or he alluded to the fact that those of us in philanthropy do have one huge advantage, which is information access. And so, when lots of people are coming to us, we are able to see the dynamics of a field in the way that no one else can. And it's not because we're smarter or better, it is solely because we have access to different information. So the real challenge in some ways is to say, actually, I do have an insight that I'm the only one who's able to get because of this information, but it doesn't make me better. And you're still the hero in this story, ultimately. All right, I'm going to do a couple more slides. One, just to think about how does all this come together? I certainly wouldn't expect that anyone is going to be an expert in all 9 of these tools, nor that an organization, even if it had experts in all 9 tools, is going to be able to use them all at once. But I do think that there are examples of organizations really tapping into multiple ways of thinking depending on the circumstances they're in. I'll give an example of World Central Kitchen, a remarkable food nonprofit founded by the chef Jose Andres there on the left. I'll just give a few examples. In Puerto Rico, after Hurricane Maria, they served 4 million meals working with 20,000 volunteers. I mean, that is essentially a case of instantly creating an institution or a set of institutions, partially through community organizing. But then afterwards, once the acute crisis was over, they started to invest in the Puerto Rican food system so that it would be less vulnerable to the supply chain disruptions that happened around the hurricane. Another interesting example is at the beginning of the pandemic, they completely changed their business model. They had historically charged donors, or said to a donor, look, it costs us about $2 to deliver a meal. And at the beginning of the pandemic, they said, that model isn't going to work. It's not going to work if we just go out and make lots and lots of food and give it out to people, because we need the restaurants to still be alive after this crisis is over. We need to instead give money to the restaurants and allow them to provide the food. That's going to cost more money. It's going to be $10 per meal, but we're still going to have a food infrastructure after this crisis has abated. A fundamental shift in their approach to the marketplace. It's interesting, then they used a similar model in the Ukraine, also trying to ensure that the Ukrainian food economy was able to continue to endure. And all through this, they regularly apply lessons from design thinking. The CEO talks about how when they first go to a crisis zone, he literally said this. He said, we pull up Google Maps and we look for the little gray rectangles, which are the trailer parks. And we go straight there and we knock on doors and we listen and ask people what they need. Which is a really amazing way to think about strategy. Okay, so there's I think, an important critique to what I've been saying, which weirdly no one has made yet, but someone should make it, which is that if you are bouncing among frameworks, you're not grounded. And I mean, this is a very real danger. There is power to consistency over time. The only way you get meaningful longitudinal data is if you have a similar process for gathering that data over time. And also, it makes it easier to collaborate and communicate when you have a common language. And so I think that's actually a very important warning or counter-argument. And I think it fundamentally comes to how tightly are we clinging to the ideas that we bring. I'll quote the Buddha again, who says that you can summarize all of his wisdom as nothing is to be clung to as I, me, or mine. Or we could quote the classic rock song, if you cling too tightly, you're going to lose control. Either way, what we have to avoid is that sort of obsessiveness with a particular framework. This still, though, leaves the question of, well, what's the grounding in then? And I believe the grounding has to be moral and ethical grounding. And if we're honest, our work is actually a tangle of ethical puzzles on a kind of a daily basis on questions of power, of information, et cetera. And so I suggest in the book, there's a chapter on ethics, a set of different ethical tensions that we often find ourselves needing to navigate in our work. Around a true sense of what's important to us. Honesty about winners and losers, and let's be honest, there sometimes are winners and losers. Dimensions of time are really important, and our ability to honor the work that came before us and the progress that has been made, while also holding responsibility for that which will come after us. We've already talked about the ethical quandaries of money and power that show up every day in the work of the people in this room. The question of living in a post-truth world, which I do not believe we are, but it sometimes feels that way, that we have to figure out how to actually describe what's really happening, but to do so with sufficient humility. And it is essential for us to understand our positioning in the world across a whole set of dimensions of identity, and to recognize that brings with it a certain perspective, but it is not the only perspective. And then maybe the one that's most important in the context of our work is figuring out how to act with people and not upon them. And I forgot one, which is you are not your organization. I think a lot of the ethical puzzles that we run into in our work come from this conflation between ourself and our organization. And that can be a real burden sometimes, but it also can get us in trouble. Okay, now we're going to do another exercise for about 8 minutes. And I call this the strategy kaleidoscope. So if we could raise the lights a little bit, that'd be great. We're just going to do brief discussions at your tables. If there are fewer than 3 people at your table, which I don't think there are, which is awesome. It feels packed in here. It's great. What I want you to do, 8 minutes, is at your table just pick an issue. It can be an issue that somebody cares about. If you get stuck, just pick climate change. But all the better if you think of something else. And then I just want you to go around the table and each person to just talk about that issue through a given lens. It could be one of these tools. It could be something else. But I just want to show, again, this is a strategy kaleidoscope, different ways of thinking about a particular issue. And it might just be a couple sentences. And I recognize I'm springing this on you and you're totally unprepared, so give each other grace. And if you have extra time, you can discuss if you see any patterns. But just pick an issue, and each person talk about it from one perspective or through one lens. You've got 8 minutes. Go. I wish I could have witnessed each and every one of those conversations. I'm going to share one kind of final thought, and then we'll have a little bit of time for discussion. And maybe folks will have something to share from their table discussions. So let's see here. I want to talk about one other kind of abundance. We've been talking about strategic abundance, but there's another kind which is structural abundance. And I will argue that we in the social sector have gotten a little bit too stuck in a model that social change happens through a particular unit of analysis, which is the individual, isolated, permanent 501c3 nonprofit. And I believe we need more dynamism, more ability to come together and break apart according to the needs of the moment and the needs of the place. That we have an opportunity to take some inspiration from flocks of starlings called murmurations, and that our work could look more like this, and that it may need to as the pace of change increases. And sometimes resources need to be aggregated, and sometimes they need to be closer to community. And the good news is there's all sorts of innovation happening on a sort of one-off basis throughout the sector. I just want to kind of mention a few to remind us of the menu of options that are available. There's mergers. Candid was formed by a merger. But there's also spin-outs. Omidyar Network has spun out a number of really interesting independent funding bodies. This organization is fascinating. It's called Integrity for America. It was founded after the neo-Nazi riots in Charlottesville in 2017 with the express purpose of proving a new way, a new legal strategy, and the intention to shut down once it succeeded. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know what the strategy exactly was, but it had something to do with suing Nazis, so that seemed like a pretty good idea. But they succeeded, and they're shut down. And you can go to their website now. It's archived. They did something for a moment and then moved on. There's interesting acquisitions happening now as well, where it's asymmetrical. And here's a case of a for-profit local newspaper being acquired by the nonprofit local NPR affiliate. Really interesting model. Then there are cases of roll-ups where multiple organizations come together. Service Year created by the rolling up of 3 separate nonprofits. Bonterra, a roll-up on the for-profit side. Network for Good, which basically was a nonprofit that turned into a for-profit. Chronicle Philanthropy, a for-profit that turned into a nonprofit. United Way engaged in all sorts of interesting joint ventures. The Partnership Project, which is a fiscal sponsor, but that goes much deeper with much deeper kinds of shared communication strategy, fundraising resources. Kaboom, we heard a lot about Kaboom yesterday. It's done some really interesting work in basically open sourcing a lot of its knowledge and content. There are distributed autonomous organizations like the Regen Network. There are organizations like Sierra Club, which really are 3 separate legal entities. Similarly, more and more funders that are a cluster of different legal entities brought together to bring different types of capital to bear. I just share this to remind us of the set of options that we have at our fingertips to match whatever the needs are of the problem we're trying to address. My hope is that we don't get outdone by a bunch of birds, and that we tap into the extraordinary diversity of structures and strategies that we have access to, because the world needs it right now. I will quote from someone who will be speaking here, Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson. In this, she was summarizing Colette Pynchon Battle. She said, the magical combination: roots, creativity, strategy, fire. That's the magical combination. I think we all have it. Let's figure out how to tap into it. And with that, we've still got a couple more minutes for questions or comments, and I would invite anything you have to share.
See, Teo Nagad, Brian Barlow Tawatong, Talik Janelle, Talsko Sud, Yawadetiad, Utan Jindel Kos Dagulastane, Chichalaki. Hello everyone, my name is Brian Barlow. I'm from Talco, Oklahoma. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, and I'm extremely pleased to be here with you guys today. I really enjoyed your talk. I found it very engaging, insightful. You pulled from a number of sources to substantiate your really dynamic view on a very, like you said, complex system. I found it really empowering, and I feel like I saw myself most reflected in your talk in those birds. You know, I think you're mentioning being outdone by birds is important. That as Native people, I have a friend here who's joined me as well. We're here together. She represents a tribal nation as well. But as Native people, we know that there are things the natural world knows that we do not. And we must look to those examples, and we must look to the way the world functions in order to work in sync with it. Guys. So I felt, represented, and I felt encouraged. And I encourage you as a person I know of influence to continue to lead into those thoughts you may have, that the natural world may have insights that we don't. So, Wadong.
Thank you. I mean, 4 billion years of evolution has pulled together some real wisdom, and hundreds of thousands of years of human history. Let's tap into that.
Hi, my name is Mickey Levitan. I'm from the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. Jacob, thank you for sharing all those tools. Terrific. I haven't had a chance to read the book yet, but in my work, one of the big challenges is sequencing, right? Which tools do you pull out when, and how do you make those decisions? So can you share with us some of your insight or guidance around that? It may already be in the book, so apologies if it already is, but I'm interested in thoughts you offer to people on that subject.
That's a fantastic question. And sequencing is something that, my old boss, Susan Bell at the Hewlett Foundation, was always getting me to think more clearly about, who do you need to talk to first? How do you need to think about this, and in what order? I mentioned that, Faye Tversky says start with purpose, and I think that's a way to anchor the sequencing. But in terms of, do you start with mathematical modeling or complex systems or behavioral economics? I think it's going to depend on the particular issue. And so what I hope people can do is have a basic, even if it's a shallow, familiarity with multiple tools, and in a sense, trust their instinct. When going through that process, well, I'm going to start here. I'm going to brainstorm using this kind of a process. But then to be more rigorous over time as you get a little bit more clarity of what is most relevant in this particular situation. I will say that, if it is truly kind of an open book, then design thinking is arguably the best place to start because it is itself a process that you might be able to bring in different frameworks to. But I also recognize that every issue is different. And to me, the important thing is to cycle through a couple. It doesn't have to be 9, just make it 2 or 3, and begin to gather the insights. And then you can put down something that's a bit more rigorous and rigid, which you can revisit down the road, but that provides some of that continuity that you might want to see.
Hi, I'm Giselle from United Way of Massachusetts Bay. And my question is similar to the sequencing question, but around, are there moments where you would want to use the tools together, or a set of tools that work naturally well, and then the inverse, tools that are really in tension with each other? Yeah,
another great question. I think, obviously you could say that, for example, math and storytelling may feel like they're in tension, and I think on the surface they are, but as I said, an equation is a story where the variables are the characters, so often you can find that interconnection between the tools. But there's no doubt that some of them are a little bit harder. They're harder tools, like markets or mathematical modeling or complex system science. Some of them are sort of softer, like storytelling or behavioral economics or design thinking. But community organizing is interesting because it can feel like it's a soft tool, But the really good community organizers are quite rigorous and thoughtful about how they're building and structuring power over time, and often will have a quantitative model behind it. So I think it's good to recognize that some of them are in tension, but that often trying to resolve those tensions, or at least recognize how they maybe kind of complement each other, can be a source of some insight. Are we out of time, or do we have time? Yep. All right, Grace says we're out of time. Folks, thank you so much. You've been an awesome audience. I really appreciate it.